So, who wins the ceasefire? As international pressure for a cessation of hostilities mounts, we take stock of 11 days of fighting between Israel and Palestinians, the worst since a 50-day war back in 2014. Back then, it was squarely about the Gaza Strip. This time, Jerusalem was the spark, a wake-up call for those who thought the Middle East might move on from the Palestinian cause with the recent normalization of ties between Israel and Arab states. Tuesday's general strikes across the occupied territories and inside Israel among Arab citizens illustrates how military objectives alone do not a victory make. At the heart of it, the same Israeli prime minister at the helm in previous wars with Gaza, this time while Benjamin Netanyahu has the public support of Israel's most important ally, the United States. Could that support be running dry? And with 11 days that sidelined his rival's bid to form a coalition government, will this ultimately play in Bibi's favor or prove to be his last stand? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the cost of the past 11 days. And joining us is Gil Mihaly, editor-in-chief of Causeur. How are you?
Great, thank you.
Thanks for coming back. You were with us when it all erupted, and we were all surprised. And here we are 11 days later. From Ramallah, Noor O'Day, former spokesperson for the Palestinian Authority. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to be joined shortly from London by Yossi Meckelberg, Associate Fellow at Chatham House, the France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, the day began with an 8-hour lull, but then rocket fire out of Gaza resumed. Gaza, where civilians have buried more dead. Authorities there speak of 230 Palestinians killed, including 65 children wounded because of aerial bombardments. Now, before we go to our panel, let's cross to Jerusalem correspondent Iris Mockler. Iris, a security cabinet convened this Thursday evening. Does that mean that we're close to an end of hostilities?
I think it does mean that. Not that we've heard from Israeli politicians. All the leaks about a ceasefire coming into effect very shortly come via Al Jazeera, and there's been some gnashing of teeth from Israeli journalists about that there's no direct communication. But the fact that the cabinet is meeting, they are considering this. They're sitting right now. It's been going for more than an hour now, and they are considering what will be, when it will start, and what it will mean. Interestingly, the Egyptians who are doing the brokering of this aren't going into terms at all. They want a ceasefire first and then truce terms to be discussed. And given the level of destruction within Gaza, I can see why they want to play it that way, rather than taking more time to consider terms, more opportunities for casualties and the destruction to continue. So that's the plan at the moment, from what we understand. A ceasefire, time not yet known, and not a truce. No negotiations to be done afterwards.
Yeah, that's an important distinction, Iris, because an Israeli security source telling our French language correspondent, Gwendoline de Bono, that what the Israeli side wants is sort of a scaled down cessation of hostilities.
It's interesting. What we've seen in the previous rounds of this conflict, 2009, 2014, and everything in between, has been, and it just ends. It just falls off a cliff, and both sides slink away, lick their wounds, bury their dead, start repairs, and wait for the next round. And I think inside Israel, there's a clamoring for the first time for a change, or the first time that I've really heard. Defense analysts, politicians, people looking for a change to that model because it is so costly, and the people who pay the costs are the civilians, not soldiers.
Who's asking for that change?
What I hear is defense analysts discussing it, politicians, former spokespersons for the IDF, for Israel's military. There's actually a discussion at that kind of level and in newspapers about, can this go on? Is this model now over? And is it time to do something else? It's a model that suits Benjamin Netanyahu. I think he would reinstate it straight away if he could. It's divide and rule in the Palestinian territories. He does divide and rule inside Israeli politics also very well. It keeps the two sides apart. He strengthens Hamas slightly. He weakens the Palestinian Authority, and that suits his goals. But people who live through this, civilians on both sides, I cannot stress how distressing it is to see that there are no soldiers fighting and actually civilians bear the brunt of this. Civilians on both sides are being asked to endure something that I don't think civilians should be asked to endure, especially, rinse and repeat in this ongoing way.
Iris Machler, many thanks for that live update from Jerusalem. I'm going to get reaction first from you here in the studio. Gil Mihaly, that rinse and repeat, could there be an end to it? Because we had it 2008, 2009, 2014. Now, is there another way?
I hope there will be an end to it, and I hope there's another way. But for the moment, we are in a very long war of attrition. People are starting to ask who won this round. I would like to remind everyone that we all asked the same questions in the end of the summer of 2006, when everyone congratulated the Hezbollah for his great victory on Israel. I think that 15 years later, things seems a bit different. You can say that from 1973, Israel doesn't do a good job about its wars, 73, 82, Intifada, another Intifada, and yet its enemies are falling apart, and Israel gets stronger and richer. So we are engaged in a very long war of attrition.
But here's the difference. Here's the difference. The Palestinians are not the Israelis' enemies. There are Arab Israelis who identify as Palestinians. They are citizens. There are Palestinian workers who work in the state of Israel. This is not the enemy we're talking about.
Yes, but there were very, very grave incidents in October 2000. And I remember people talking at the time that we are back to 48 after 50 years, as if nothing had happened. The wounds are reopened. There were, I think, 15 or 16 Arab Israelis who were killed by the police. Shlomo Ben-Ami, who was a very moderate minister of the police, it was the end of his career, and it was doomsday's discourse at the time. And 21 years later, a month ago, Netanyahu was legitimizing the representative of the Muslim brethren in the Arab Israeli population because he thought that they couldn't have a government together. So I'm not trying to rose wash reality. Reality is very harsh, but it's not the end of the world. Things are not collapsing, and we've seen a lot worse.
We've seen a lot worse. Noor Odeh, your thoughts. Is there an alternative? It was the question posed by our correspondent at the outset. Is there realistically an alternative to this nightmare scenario that seems to creep up all of a sudden every several years?
Of course there is. That alternative is quite simple, which is for Israel to end its colonial occupation and for Israel to actually face consequences for once. The reality that Palestinians will now be living, if a ceasefire or an end to the aggression is declared, will not be one of peace. It will be one of repression, of siege in Gaza. It is a violent reality because an entire people lives under the boot of Israel's occupation. That reality is not sustainable. No country can sustain a racist colonial regime while expecting the population under its illegal control to be tranquil and acquiescent and to just accept that repression and dispossession without any resistance. So we will keep coming back to these rounds of agony and suffering where scores of children and women and civilians, Palestinian, are murdered, many in their sleep, because Israel does not want to let go of this enterprise and because the world doesn't want to hold it accountable. Talking about an end to this round will not resolve the core cause of why these flare-ups happen, of why people got angry in the first place in this latest round, which is our Israeli actions in Jerusalem. So treating the symptoms will simply not suffice. And I fear that this time around, it will just become even more frustrating, and not less so.
More frustrating, not less so. Nuruddin, to get beyond this rinse and repeat, as Iris Makler said, you need legitimate leadership on both sides. Right now, Israel's got political gridlock with its fourth snap general election, possibly a fifth. We'll talk about that in a little while. But also, we saw the sudden announcement that the first Palestinian elections in 15 years had been suspended. And the buildup to all of this, both sides need to get their house in order?
Yeah, but I'll tell you something, and I'll remind the audience. Israel was killing and dispossessing Palestinians before there was a Palestinian government, before there was Hamas, before there were any of these Palestinian factions. So just to keep things in perspective and context. Having said that, I will tell you that the Palestinian political system does need a shakeup. It needs all political players in Palestine need to get together, to sit on the table, and to understand that reviving our democratic institutions is of vital significance. And this is something that cannot be understated. But that's an internal Palestinian burden that we will all have to bear very, very soon. And it is very obvious, and there's a lot of debate and a lot of work on that, despite the regrettable obstruction of elections or indefinite delay of elections that we saw at the end of April. But again, it's not the Palestinian leadership issue that is standing in the way of Israel ending its occupation. It can do that with or without a revival of Palestinian institutions. It actually has an obligation to do that regardless. So let's not give any pretenses to Israel not doing what it should do for its own sake, and also in order to be in line with international law and to stop enjoying this exceptionalism that the world has kind of provided it with for so many years.
Let's now join from London, Yossi Meckelberg, Associate Fellow at the Chatham House think tank. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.
Hello, good evening.
So we're discussing how do you get beyond coming back and having on this set the same discussion in a couple of years' time, where we'll again be faced with this kind of horrific conflict where there are civilians casualties on both sides. And one of the questions is, Yossi Meckelberg, we thought, or some thought, that, well, with this normalization of ties between Israel and Arab states that we saw in the past year, this Palestinian question, maybe we can approach it from sort of an outside-in approach, and we don't. It doesn't have to blow up like it did in the past. Of course, that's been proved wrong now. Your thoughts of how you deal with it?
Well, one of the things is that we can't normalize the situation as it is between the Israeli-Palestinians, that every few years there is a round of violence, many people are losing their lives. What seems to be war crimes are committed, by the way, by both sides. Obviously, this is an asymmetric conflict, and as a result, there are so many innocent lives lost also, or mainly on the Palestinian side. We need to get to the bottom of the conflict. And this is not recognizing that any solution should first and foremost be based on the recognition that every single person between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, and let me include also the Palestinian refugees, deserve exactly the same rights. You can't have some people have all the rights and other people don't have the rights. And if we start from there, then we can start looking into solutions. I still belong to those who believe that one way or another, two-state solution, and there are different modalities of them, can still work. But we need to accept that there is first and foremost an issue of basic human rights. Now, if we don't deal with the issue of self-determination for both, Jerusalem is capital for both, security for every human being, and so on and so forth, the rights and just and fair solution for the Palestinian issue, we want more from there, because this, what's happened now, only radicalize both sides and almost give legitimacy to the use of force. While this wheel is turning in one direction, we need to stop it and start, with the help of the international community, to start turning it in exactly the opposite direction.
You mentioned the international community. The White House press secretary in the past hour saying reports of a move towards a ceasefire are, quote, clearly encouraging. On Wednesday, a White House spokesperson, Karine Jean-Pierre, stopped short, though, of using the C word, ceasefire. But the message is getting louder from Washington. Let's listen.
The president conveyed to the prime minister that he expected a significant de-escalation today on the path to a ceasefire.
Yossi Mekelberg, your thoughts on the fact that the Biden administration in public has tread very carefully?
I must say first, why does it take 10 days of killing, of bloodshed, to get to this point? Because this should have taken place 24 hours within. The idea that Israel has the right to defend itself is a cliche, it's a euphemism. Of course it has the right to defend itself. Every country, every government should defend its own people. But why it took so long? Now, of course, at a certain point you get to a situation that both sides are tired of this. Even Israel close to admit that it doesn't have, in such a small enclave with 2 million people, one of the most impoverished places in the world, that they run out of targets. So here is the time to call a ceasefire. It should have been called before, but again, it's also for the United States. And I think if there is any silver lining, I think that the Biden administration had no interest in Israel-Palestinian, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It would have done very little to try to promote any type of negotiations there or engagement. I think it was sucked into that against its will. While it has other priority, maybe it was an early lesson not to leave the situation going on. Call a ceasefire and start dealing with, again, the root causes of the conflict.
All right, we're going to pick up on that with our panel when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we are looking at not just the ingredients for a ceasefire, but the ingredients of not being in the same place in a few years' time where Israel and Gaza are once again at war with civilians bearing the brunt. With us, Gil Mehaley, editor-in-chief of Causeur, from Ramallah, Noor Odeh, former spokesperson for the Palestinian Authority, and from London, Yossi Mekelberg, associate fellow at Chatham House, who just before the break talked about the U.S. At its peril deciding that the Middle East would not be top of its in-tray. Noor Odeh, do you agree that the fact that the U.S. is now going to be forced to pay more attention is a good thing?
Well, it's a double-edged sword. Let's see what they do. If their attitude towards reaching a ceasefire is any indication, then it's not really very promising. It seems that the Biden administration, without being really pushed into a positive direction, is far more comfortable with kind of dusting off old formulas from the drawer and reusing what was relevant or maybe feasible in the early 2000s. And that's just no longer the case.
But are you sure that's not just public rhetoric and that there's a difference between what they're feeding the public and the messages that are being conveyed in private?
Well, why should there be any difference? I mean, if the Biden administration is truly committed to have a human rights-based policy, then it should have it out in the open. It shouldn't be embarrassed to say that Palestinian lives matter. It shouldn't be embarrassed to say that it will scrutinize the sale of nearly $1 billion of weapons and bombs to Israel while it's raining those bombs on Palestinians. That shouldn't be a controversial thing, especially given the advanced positions of the constituency of this administration, which is far ahead of Biden and his cabinet on the issue of Palestine and on the issue of how to reach peace through achieving justice in this region. So I'm still quite skeptical. I'm not sure that, Biden can change his skin, but, you never know. This is the place where a lot of miracles happen. So maybe, we have one in spare for Biden. Who knows?
Who knows? Gilma Haley, another miracle. It would be a miracle if the U.S. Senate approved the resolution put forward this Thursday by Bernie Sanders, which is calling for a halt to military exports to Israel. Nonetheless, the fact that that's happening, it shows the Democratic Party, there is pressure on the U.S. president right now. Your thoughts on all of this?
I agree with Nora. The main point is the internal American arena, the constituencies, and probably there are going to be two extremisms. There will be the pro-Israeli bloc based on the Christian vote, on the Christian Zionism ideology, and there will be the progressive leftist Bernie, the young Congress members, and it's a characteristic of the whole American political scene. It's going to be a Cold War within the American political scene, and Israel will be one of the issues and not the least important. But I wanted to make two remarks about things that were said before. First of all, there was violence between Israel and the Palestinians is around a territory with no settlements and no Israeli presence. And the second thing is that if Gaza is closed to the world, it's not only because of Israel, but also because Egypt closed the border, and there was never a question of firing rockets or putting pressure on Egypt, even if the Egyptians could have changed the situation dramatically in 5 minutes. Just, opening like between France and Belgium, for example.
And just to explain to our viewers on that score, it's the Egyptians who are playing the mediators. Why?
Because they have an interest in keeping the role of the mediator between Israel and the Hamas. It gives them power. They are not interested in a conflict in Gaza. They are interested in peace and quiet. They don't want a Palestinian state because they were the occupying force between 49 and 67. And just like the Jordanians, they didn't even dream of giving the Palestinians what they support the Palestinians today. So between 49 and 67, when Arabs were occupying the territories, no one demanded that these territories become a Palestinian state. They were talking only about what was in Israel at the time. Now, in the summer of 2005, Israel decided in a mutually accepted unilateral withdrawal to give a chance to the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority will no, we don't agree, but they will take the territory. And those who the dreamers at the time thought it's going to be something like Singapore, and that will create a new dynamic. Well, the Palestinians decided to vote for Hamas in January of 2006. At 4 months after the Israeli withdrawal, they voted for the Hamas, and the first thing the Hamas did with the power was to dig the tunnel through which they abducted the soldier Shalit and put fire in Gaza. It was the first round of violence in Gaza, and this crisis tempted Hezbollah. So it was also the trigger for the long war in Lebanon in 2006. And at this point, Hezbollah killed the Israeli peace camp and opened the way for the longest reign of the right in Israel with
I don't want to go, because
Netanyahu.
we're short on time. I don't want to go back to the genesis of it all and the accusations.
It's 15 years.
No, but there's the accusation as well that Israel at one point bolstered Hamas
Never
as a counterforce against Fatah back in the day. But Noor O'Day, I don't want to talk about history. I want to ask you, at this point in time today, what is the role of Egypt and what is Egypt's responsibility?
just for the sake of clarity for the viewers, the United Nations still considers Israel to be the occupying power in the Gaza Strip. It has absolute power over Gaza's airspace and borders, just so that we're clear, because there were too many inaccuracies to respond to in your guest's remarks. Egypt has a strategic interest in making sure that this aggression ends. It has absolutely no interest in seeing the already catastrophic humanitarian crisis further deteriorate. And quite frankly, it has an interest in being a major player in the region and maintaining that role, and that it has done as expected. So the Egyptian role will always be extremely important in ensuring peace and stability in the region.
Why aren't they opening the border?
Why
aren't they opening the border permanently?
Why is Israel not respecting its obligations? Israel is the occupying power, and Gaza is part of the occupied territory. It's not part of Egypt.
But why Egypt? Why is Egypt? I don't understand. They can ease the suffering of the population.
You are
for humanitarian reasons.
One at a time. Nuruddin.
That is available. Humanitarian assistance does cross through Egypt. Egypt has opened its hospitals to Palestinians injured by Israeli strikes. Egypt has sent its ambulances, and Palestinians will always be grateful for that. The responsibility, the onus under international law is on Israel to make sure that the connection, the contiguity of the Palestinian territory is not disrupted, the connection with the West Bank is not severed, and that is on Israel, not on Egypt. Egypt will remain a very important player in Palestinian politics, in the Palestinian struggle for freedom, but that does not abrogate the responsibilities that are defined under international law of Israel, of high contracting parties, of permanent members of the Security Council, including the US and France and others.
Yossi Mekelberg, your thoughts on this?
I must admit, I find it a bit disingenuous. That the fact that Israel has responsibility, even if it withdraw, I absolutely agree. I don't think even the Palestinian Authority sees what is just being said about the role of Egypt. There is plenty of criticism among the Palestinian Authority and among Palestinians and Gaza on the role of the Egyptian, because the Egyptians are coordinating their role, what they are doing with the Israelis and not with the Palestinians. So let's put it on the table. Let me also say something about 2005, because this is really inaccurate and it's important to the way we look at it now. There is a clue in the name. It was unilateral withdrawal. And this was the arrogance of not coordinating it with the Palestinian Authority.
Could that have been possible?
It was possible. It was possible there, and it should have been done. And at the time, the grand strategy, the grand plan of Ariel Sharon was not only to withdraw unilaterally from Gaza, but do exactly the same in the West Bank, because he decided that he could actually draw the borders and future borders between the Israelis and the Palestinians without negotiating it. And this is unacceptable in diplomacy. This will never be sustainable if you behave so arrogantly, even if someone that you regard as your enemy, because this enemy is supposed to be your neighbor the very next day. And that was the mistake that Sharon did. It was a typical mistake by Sharon. We should have learned with this. The same goes for Camp David. It doesn't make the Hamas nice in any way or form. I don't think anyone of us here would like to see Hamas in power, though it's for the Palestinians to decide who they want to be governed by. But the fact is, in order to reach a peace agreement, both sides needs to negotiate in good faith. If they are not going to do that, in addition, only one point, you need an honest broker. You need someone that can really be the honest broker between the two sides. Without it, it's very difficult.
All right.
No,
so
you need a strong broker that can put pressure on both sides. If he's honest, it's nice to have.
Okay, a strong broker or an honest broker. Right now, we talked about in part one of our discussion, you also need legitimate leadership. And the last time Gil Mehaly was with us, it was on day 2. The Israeli prime minister was simply a caretaker prime minister. That has all changed since the fighting erupted. He was handed a political lifeline when his main rival, Yair Lapid, lost potential backer Naftali Bennett. Lapid has until June the 2nd, or else Israel may face its fifth snap general election on the trot. The Jerusalem Post this Thursday, quoting a Likud member, is also a senior political advisor to the prime minister, saying Netanyahu is playing on the operation in Gaza to use up the days given to Yair Lapid for the mandate to form a government without any real plan. The collapse of Naftali Bennett is giving Netanyahu a boost, but support for him within the Likud is weakening. Is that how you read it, Gil Mehaly, right now?
No, I think that he was probably saved by this war. I don't think it was him who manipulated. If you look at the long term, the last time that a moderate government was elected in Israel was in the elections of March 2006, where Israelis believed that the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza will bring a new era to the region. And at this election, the Likud with Netanyahu got 10%, 12 seats. The Arab Israelis today have more seats than the Likud in 2006, when Israelis believed that there could be a solution, a peaceful solution with the Palestinians. Ever since Hamas killed the last hope in the Israeli electorate for that, Netanyahu is getting stronger and stronger. And, maybe it's a coincidence that this time again, Hamas saved his career.
You agree with that, Yossi Meckelberg?
No, I don't think Netanyahu is getting stronger and stronger. He's getting weaker, but the right in Israel is getting stronger and stronger, and also the far right is getting stronger and stronger. That's one of the issues there. If you actually remove Netanyahu from the equation, you can have tomorrow a very right-wing government in Israel. I think we should really worry about it. I think it also shows that Naftali Bennett's spine is a bit flexible when it comes to politics. He moves with the wind, while the idea was to have a change government that can move forward without Netanyahu. Now, I don't think Netanyahu orchestrated all what we see there. Even he can do that, but he contributed to the condition that led to the situation now, but he does manipulate it right now in his favor, because it's not only about political power. It's about his corruption trial, and more than anything else, he's bothered by this than anything to do with the Israelis and the Palestinians. He couldn't care less.
Noor Odeh, does it matter to Palestinians who the Prime Minister of Israel is?
Of course it does. And like your guest said, right now, the competition in Israel is between the right and the far right. And both seem to be on the rise, not on the way down. And that is a cause for concern, especially in light of what we talked about earlier in the debate, which is the fact that Israel has been given a free pass all this time. So the incitement that we hear, the incitement that we see, the normalization of dehumanizing Palestinians and calling for their death and even their annihilation in Gaza, as we've seen in the past 11 days on Israeli TV, will continue. And, for Palestinians, I have to tell you, every time Israel has an election, people hold their breath because they expect a round of escalation. They expect that whoever wants to win the maximum seats will kind of try to flex their muscles and show how tough they can be on Palestinians. So it's never a comfortable period for Palestinians under Israel's occupation. Having said that, whether Netanyahu survives or not, right now, I'm not sure that whoever will come in his stead will have a much different agenda. Most Israeli parties ran on a no to anything Palestinian agenda, no to a Palestinian state, no to ceding the illegal control over occupied East Jerusalem, no to the right of Palestinian refugees, no to Palestinian statehood, and no to even negotiating. So right now, these are the competing agendas. They disagree on everything except on saying no to Palestine.
Unless, Gil Mehaly, the last 11 days have perhaps changed, and it's what we talked about at the outset, the thinking in Israel, where it's got to be less about tactics, military tactics, but more about a long-term strategy. Could there be a change? We've seen it with the fact that there's been so much alarm expressed across the political spectrum in Israel over the fighting we've seen in what had been up to now peaceful, mixed neighborhoods where you had Jews and Arab Israelis.
I think this is the key. I think the Arab-Israeli population is the key. And I think that what happened before the election is very, very important. The fact that Netanyahu legitimized the most radical Arab party in Israel. First of all, it's a tribute to the Israeli democracy. The fact that there is people think that it makes Israel weaker, but the fact that everyone is represented and that you need to count fingers in order to have a government, it has also this good impact on Israeli society. And I think that the fact that you put them in the game is a game changer.
And now they took part Tuesday in a general strike.
Yes, they did.
So what does that mean going forward? Will that have any effect on the thinking in the high halls of power? What the Arab Israelis are doing now is perfectly natural. And I would like to remind you that, generally speaking, except for specific areas when there is a specific problem, like in Jaffa, like in Lod, and like in Saint-Jean d'Acre, we can talk about it. It's a very specific sociology of the Arab population. I think that, generally speaking, the situation was not that bad. We've seen worse. And I think that the majority of the Arab Israelis will start rebuilding what was destroyed in the last 11 days. And I think that legitimizing them and putting them in the center of the Israeli political game might be the key for something else to happen. I don't know exactly how, but when both sides, the right and the left, need them, their voice will be heard. Yossi Meckelberg, you agree?
Well, I think there are places to start with that. For instance, the nation-state law that should have never been enacted. This should be abrogated. A law that discriminates the Palestinian citizens of Israel. You need to stop with other discriminatory laws. Of course, that is something that Israel is doing for 73 years. Discriminate its Arab population. Treats citizens supposed to have the same rights, not as equal, and including not having as legitimate partner in governments, though they are citizens. And Netanyahu didn't do because he changed his ideology. He's desperate to form a government. You need people that really believe
this is the best motivation.
Well, if the only thing Israel can move on is through desperation, God save us. But I take it further. Also, I want also to the previous speaker. You know, the dehumanization and demonization is not only in the Israeli side, with all due respect, is on both sides. And I think also for us to learn to lower the tone sometimes, all commentators, because we see it in all stations, is to stop demonizing each other and dehumanize, because this makes it so difficult in the day after a ceasefire to sit around the table and start to talking to each other first and foremost as human beings. And that's what we are, who we are. Human beings that need to learn to live together peacefully, to coexist. And it won't help to portray each other as demons if we want to live in peace.
And that'll be the final word for now. I want to thank you, Yossi Meckelberg, for joining us from London, Noor Odeh in Ramallah. I also want to thank Gil Mihaly, and thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.